If you've listened to Brülosophy at all, you know how much we love imperial yeast. The company was founded on the ideal that if you're going to do something, do it right. From their imperial pitch-right pouches, packing a whopping 200 billion cells of healthy and viable yeast in each pouch, to their commitment to commercial customers guaranteeing 10 of their most popular strains are in stock for orders up to 20 liters, or the shipping is free, Imperial Yeast does it right. No more worrying about whether you need to make a starter or propagate your yeast prior to pitching. Imperial Yeast makes it easy for the home brewer and commercial brewer to obtain direct pitches at proper rates when you need it. To place a commercial order or to get more information about everything that Imperial Yeast has to offer, head on over to imperialyeast.com. Welcome to the Brew Lab. The German beer purity law, the Reinheitsgebot, was enacted in 1516 and mandated that beer be made with malt, water, and hops. This lasting tradition has certainly influenced American brewing traditions, where most craft beer is brewed using those ingredients, plus yeast. But most of the biggest brands in the world use adjuncts like rice or corn to make the best-selling beers in the world. I'm your host, Cade Joe, but today I'm back in the lab with my co-host, Jordan Folks, as we talk about last week's episode on malted rice.
It's kind of fun to think about this from an American brewing perspective because it really is the fifth ingredient, adjunct. But I guess, like you talked about in the last episode, is this stuff even an adjunct anymore once we start malting it?
Yeah, right. That's all about definitions, and that's certainly something I want to ask you about. Like, what's your definition of an adjunct? Because I'm not sure that, we were talking about German influence versus Belgian influence, and I made the comments that Belgians will kind of brew with anything, and that's kind of the case, but also not really. But I wonder if Belgians would consider anything an adjunct, or what their definition then is there too. But we'll get to that in a little bit. In any event, Bernardo Pontes Guimarães and Dr. Scott LaFontaine have just started scratching the surface of scientific research into brewing with malted rice. Now, gluten-free brewers have been using this ingredient for a while, but its supply and availability is still limited. So during this episode, Scott and Bernardo and I talked about the cool potential for using this adjunct. So I wanted to know, where do adjuncts stand in the world of brewing? How do you brew with them? What are the processing challenges, flavor characteristics, not just for malted rice, but for all the other things like rice, corn, sorghum, millet, whatever other, sugar, candy sugar, other adjuncts that Jordan and I have experience with. And I also wanted to know what's considered an adjunct. So Jordan and I are going to tackle these questions as we apply the science from the last episode. But first, if you're not already a patron of Brülosophy, please consider becoming one. We really appreciate the support we get from our patrons. And as a reward, of course, you get access to unpublished contributor recipes, discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invite to a monthly live Q&A session. Becoming a patron is easy. There's no obligation. You can cancel at any time. But if you're out there listening to this show and consuming all the other free content that's available to you through Brülosophy, I really hope you'll consider becoming a patron. On the website alone, there are over 400 experiments, several of which we're going to talk about today on this episode, where we test individual brewing variables by running through a triangle sensory test. There's the Short and Shoddy series, Brew It Yourself, and of course the new Brülosophy show on YouTube, and the OG podcast that got me interested in the science of brewing, the Brülosophy podcast. All of this comes to you for free, and we couldn't do it without the support of our patrons. So please head over there to patreon.com/Brülosophy to sign up. Another great way to support us is by using the links at brülosophy.com/support. There are some really cool affiliates who give us a small kickback if you purchase from their site by using one of Brülosophy's links. It doesn't change any part of your shopping experience, but it does help us out. So head over to brülosophy.com/support to check it out. All right, for this week's feedback, listener Andreas wrote in. He says, "Greetings from Orust Island." I hope that's the way that you say it. It's the Swedish West Coast. I want to start by saying that I love what Brülosophy is doing. You've brought me many hours of joy listening to the podcasts and lately watching Martin Keane do cool stuff on YouTube. I hope you'll have the energy to keep up the awesome work for years to come. You've inspired me in many ways. I brew with my own yeast culture that I grew up from black currants in 2018 and have been pitching it consecutively since, and I've recently gotten into malting my own barley. I'm currently listening to the Brew Lab episode where Cade and Jordan talk about Lodo and reducing FAN, free amino nitrogen. They speculate that Lodo brewing might also reduce FAN as the methods are similar. While that might very well be the case, my guess is that most of the techniques in Lodo actually reduce lipids. The Master Brewers podcast just recently talked about the topic of reducing lipids, and the methods are quite the same as Lodo, but without the whole hassle of capping the mash and adding oxygen scavenging chemicals. While I don't really think it does anything on a homebrew setup without mash rakes and the like, I find it fascinating. Have a fantastic time and keep up the good work. Best regards, Andreas.
This is interesting, and I'm curious, Cade, if you listened to that Master Brewers episode. I have not heard it, so I don't know much about reduction of lipids, but I will say that I find this comment kind of comical, without the whole added hassle of capping the mash and adding the chemicals. Really, those are two of the easiest parts of Lodo brewing. It's all the deoxygenation of your strike water and wet milling and underletting and all that. That, to me, seems like the big hassle, so... maybe they're onto something there, though. I don't know. Yeah,
that's true. That's kind of funny thinking about that, right? The mash capping and adding oxygen scavenging chemicals are easy, where all the other stuff is tough. I wonder, I don't know how related fans and lipids are. But maybe they react in the same ways, right? So maybe it's all three of the above, right? Maybe it's reducing Lodo and by extension reducing both fan and lipids. So, because my understanding of lipids is they're like fatty acid chains. So they're just long fatty acid chains. So maybe those are also reacting in the same way that maybe free amino nitrogen might, or proteins might. So it's interesting. I don't know enough about that chemistry, but it's certainly something. And now you've pointed me to another podcast that I need to listen, because like you, Jordan, I haven't listened to that latest Master Brewers podcast. But I will do that, and then maybe hopefully we can give you some better tips and tricks or feedback on lipids. So thanks for the feedback, Andreas, and after this short break, we'll be back talking about adjuncts and adjunct brewing. The dry yeast revolution is here, and Cellar Science is leading the charge. Cellar Science has expanded the world of dry yeast far beyond the drab landscape of yesteryear. With over 20 strains of beer and wine yeast now available, you can brew any style. Not to mention that their unique growth and harvesting process greatly increases lipid levels in yeast cell walls, removing the need to aerate your wort on the first pitch and allowing you to directly pitch without rehydration. Couple that with the other advantages of dry yeast, such as higher cell count and viability, and you can clearly see why commercial breweries across the U.S. are using dry yeast and choosing Cellar Science.
Denim is in demand at Plato's Closet in West Ashley and North Charleston. Get cash on the spot for everything denim. Bring in your trendy and classic styles of gently used name brand denim. Get paid for your denim shorts, skirts, jackets, jeans, and more. We're looking for denim that is blue, black, or a bold color, and jeans in styles like mom jeans, bootcut, baggy, flared, and ripped. We want everything denim. Sell your denim for cash at Plato's Closet today. Plato's Closet, located in West Ashley on Sam Rittenberg Boulevard and North Charleston on Rivers Avenue.
Ever tried reading while jogging, cooking, or even juggling flaming torches? Yeah, it doesn't end well. But with audiobooks.com, you can conquer books without the circus act. Dive into over 450,000 titles, including more than 10,000 free ones. Get hooked on a bestseller, find your next obsession, or finally read that classic you've been avoiding since high school. And here's the inside scoop. Sign up today for a free 30-day trial and snag your first 3 audiobooks on the house. Sign up for your free trial at audiobooks.com/podcastfree today. That's audiobooks.com/podcastfree.
Being from Texas, where it's hot for the better part of the year, a crisp, crushable, refreshing, easy drinking beer holds a special place in my heart. And Jordan, I don't know about you, but I think you're more of a beer purist, preferring German-style all-malt lagers. Not that they can't also be crisp, refreshing, and easy drinking, but there's just something nice about an American adjunct lager that I will always love.
I tend to like all types of beer, and I do think that there is a place for American adjunct lager. The American light lager is a little too light for me, just not enough flavor. But Miller High Life is a fantastic beer, and I've even been on a little bit of a kick lately of kind of mess around with some of the pre-pro styles. So I'm coming around on adjuncts. As much as I love all malt lagers, there's something special about the just really dry, crisp effect you can get with using a little bit of adjunct in a lager brew.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting too. So, I think back, one of the original pilsners that I had, one of the original German pilsners, one of the first times I tried it and I was like, ugh, this thing's super bitter. And that's, because of the hops, right? That's style appropriate. But I realized that like American lagers, what I had to come to be known as a quote Pilsner, which I don't think are technically, sure, American style Pilsner, I guess you can call it that. But in any event, they're not as bitter and they're not as hoppy. And so I think that was one of the first reasons why I was like, oh, I'm not as big of a fan of like German style malt lagers, because I've been just drinking American style lagers. And of course, a big component of that is the use of things like rice or corn. I mean, we all remember the Super Bowl ads from a couple of years ago, right? Where the Bud Knight is going and, destroying the corn syrup, vats or something from Miller versus Bud. And that's been a kind of a fun, interesting American historical thing, right? Is using rice and corn to brew alongside of lager yeast and malted barley, which was hugely of a German influence, but using American ingredients that were close to where people were living and brewing. So that kind of raises that question. What counts as an adjunct, and how do you define adjuncts, Jordan? I'm wondering what your thoughts are.
Yeah, so I think that an adjunct would be some sort of fermentable sugar source that's not barley. So maybe even wheat would count as an adjunct. But also, in the, sour brewing world, we might think of fruit as an adjunct as well. So pretty much any source of sugar that's not from barley would be my guess, but I'm not so sure how accurate that is in the grander literature of things.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I don't think there is a consistent definition in the literature, right? Because I think a lot of people would refer to it as anything that's any source of starch that's not malted barley. So, but that starch thing is kind of interesting, right? Because starch would mean like that's something that needs to be mashed, like rice or corn, right? Those are obviously sources of starch, and through some processing techniques that we'll talk about here later, like a cereal mash, you can access that starch using barley enzymes. So that it kind of makes sense as like that's one definition of an adjunct. But what if I just dump sugar in the fermenter? Isn't that also kind of adding an adjunct, right? If I just dunk dextrose, like corn sugar, into the fermenter or at the end of the boil kettle, now I didn't add any malted barley. I am adding a fermentable sugar source, but that also could be an adjunct. And then, like you said, fruit. What if I, go into a barrel or, put some fruit in a barrel or into a secondary fermentation? That's also going to add a fermentable sugar source and some flavor and all that stuff. And then you've got adjuncts, but then are we limited even to just like, what if I used spices? Like, are spices adjunct? Or what if I used a different kind of yeast like Brettanomyces or some lactobacillus or something? And we're now in adjunct. I mean, I don't want to get too like metaphorical out here on defining it, but my point is adjunct is a really loose term, and it seems kind of like, maybe like geophysically located, right? Or like there's some geophysical relationship to adjuncts, right? Would UK brewers think of adjuncts the same way as Belgians or Germans or Americans or Australians or Africans or, East Asians? I mean, would any of these people think about adjuncts in the same way?
I mean, I guess you make a good point that these words are the words that we've assigned to mean something, and it's all fairly arbitrary or up for debate or various systems of categorization. But I think generally speaking, in the brewing world, an adjunct is also kind of associated with like a minority of your fermentable sugars. I think there's probably some wheat beer deviations from that rule of thumb, but when I think about adjuncts, it's like 5%, maybe up to 40%, but it's not really 100% of the grist or fermentable sugar sources until recently with some of these newer malted grains that are really kind of taking off in the gluten-free world.
Yeah, exactly. Or, I think something too like malted wheat, or like, some beers have a huge proportion, maybe even like 60% of malted wheat that are used there. So if you've got 60% malted wheat and 40%, barley, are you brewing beer? Or are you brewing an adjunct beer? I mean, again, I don't want to get too metaphysical in this, but my point here is just that there's a whole lot of squishy wiggle room here between, in determining what is an adjunct and what's not, and more importantly, what we can brew with and what we can't. Now, if you're in Bavaria and you're brewing a lager beer, you're limited to malt, water, yeast, and hops. And that's sort of this interesting phenomenon has grown up because of that, meaning even you can't add things like lactic acid, to your mash. You have to use sourgut, or you have to use acidified malt. You can't add, things that even are there, just not in their pure chemical forms. So there's sort of this, I'm not going to say, maybe bastardization is the way of thinking about it. But if we can brew beer with, just using malted barley and other fermentable sources, then limiting ourselves to just malted barley, water, yeast, and hops seems very restrictive. And this is that whole German versus Belgian brewing thing that I was talking about earlier, and really most of the rest of the world, especially if you look into like East Asia. I mean, they're brewing with whatever they can find, right? Like malted barley isn't really grown in East Asia, so they're brewing rice beers, but they're calling them different things. They're 100% maybe rice beers, or even making, different spirits out of rice and things. So I would think from an adjunct perspective, I think for us, and for what most brewers consider, there's kind of three major types. And that's these like mashable adjuncts, so things that are other than malted barley, that go in the mash. And that would be things that have starch that's available for conversion. So things like rice and corn and wheat and oats and rye, things that have some bound up starch that you can actually convert, or that proteins or some other nutrient, something that needs to go in the mash so that it makes it into the beer. And then there's a kettle adjunct. So that's something that's like already converted. That's usually just sugars like candy sugar or like dextrose or, something that's going into the kettle. And then there's fermentation adjuncts. And so this is where I consider like bottle conditioning sugars are kind of an adjunct. We don't bottle condition with malted barley, right? We're bottle conditioning with dextrose or honey or syrup or, something like that. And then fruits also would be fermentation adjuncts. So there's kind of three major types: mashable, kettle, and fermentation adjuncts. So I wanted to talk through kind of just as a list of common adjuncts, and then talk about like some general concerns for each of these adjuncts. And then we'll take a break and come back and sort of break down into each adjunct and talk about, some things that are unique to their use, and also share some of the Brülosophy experiments that we've done, because we've done quite a lot of adjunct brewing experiments on Brülosophy. So what are some common adjuncts for you, Jordan, that you would think of as like, yeah, okay, these are adjuncts. These are non-malted barley.
Well, the big ones I think of are rice, corn, and oats. And those can come in various varieties. And then I guess if wheat does count as an adjunct, then I would include that one as well.
Mm-hmm. Do you count wheat or no?
Yeah, I'm not totally sure. And I guess I'm not super caught up in it, but I guess depends on the day.
Fair enough, right? And maybe it doesn't matter too, right? Like if you're trying to brew under the Reinheitsgebot, it matters. But if you're not, I mean, lest we forget, that was the reason the Reinheitsgebot was enacted, right? Because brewers were using wheat, but wheat was also being made for bread and food. And so the king of Bavaria had to say, like, no, you can't use wheat for beer because we need people to eat bread.
Yeah, and I think this story goes that except wheat beers because he liked them so much.
Yeah, except wheat beers. Well, no. He was the one that authorized it. So for a long time, he loved wheat beers. And so he owned the right to tell you whether or not you could brew a beer with wheat. And so he said...
And he drank them, right?
Yeah, and he drank them. And he gave it to like certain brewers. So certain people got the ability to continue to make Weiss beer, whereas everybody else was just on their own.
But I think one of the key differences here is all of these operate a little differently, right? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So, for example, with wheat, at least for me, I tend to get lower efficiency with it. I think that can be some concerns with other malted varieties like malted corn or malted rice, other malted adjunct varieties. Some of these can create some haze. Some of these can make a drier beer than barley. Some can have milling considerations. And so I think that's one of the key differentiating factors from a practical brewing perspective is you just have to think and treat these things differently than you would with a basic all barley mash.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, wheat has lower starch available, just like oats too. If you tried to brew a beer with 100% oats, you wouldn't hit the same OGs that you would hit with barley because there's starch availability isn't there. Now, oats are going to have a lot more protein, so you're going to have a lot more foam stability, which is good. Maybe some haze as well, right? Because protein reacts with hop acids to create haze. But that's one of those instances of difference. Oats have not as much starch, but they do have protein and haze, which, hey, great for those hazy IPAs, the New England IPAs that everybody's been brewing. That's a great thing, right? And then, there's malted versus unmalted versions of all of these. So there's malted wheat, there's unmalted wheat, there's malted rice, unmalted rice, malted corn, unmalted corn. And then we get into all of this flaked, right? Torrefied or flaked grains like flaked rice, flaked corn, flaked oats is another one that you have. And then, of course, the Belgian tradition of using Belgian candy sugars, right, that are invert sugars that are just candies. And then there's syrups that can also be added in fruit. And then, of course, don't forget Guinness in Ireland, right, which has a huge adjunct, which is an adjunct beer, I think is hilarious to think of because it uses roasted barley, right? It's unmalted barley as I can't remember. What is it? 95% pale malt and 5% roasted barley, something like that, Jordan?
That's what I recall being the rumor.
Yeah. So that's Guinness, right? Which is one of the best selling beers in the world and is also an adjunct lager. So I also, like you, Jordan, I want to make a comment here too, since we share our opinions often on the show. Like this whole division between like adjunct and not adjunct to me is a little bit comical too, because it's kind of like just brew with what you want, right? Everybody can make great beer using more than just 4 ingredients. And so if you want to do that, go for it. If you want to stay under your the Reinheitsgebot, then do that. But I really like some of these ingredients. I worked at a sour brewery in Austin. And I loved adding fruit to beer. That was one of those things that 10 or 15 years ago, I would have said like, oh, no way. Or if you tried to serve a fruit beer to my dad, he'd be like, no, I don't want fruit in my beer. I just drink, American light lagers. And that's what he drinks. I call it dad beer for that reason, because that's what he drinks. But I love fruit in my beer. I love a little bit of sourness. I love some candy sugar in a double, right? Those things are really great and they make the style. So they're intended to be used in that style. So again, to me, it's a little bit hard to call them an adjunct when you need some of that candy sugar to make a double, right, Jordan?
Right, but nonetheless, call them what you want. They do have some practical considerations if you're going to use them. So maybe we can kind of talk a little bit about how you go about using these quote-unquote adjuncts, because ultimately they are different from barley in terms of how you go about using them.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, the big one, again, is one of the things we talked about last week with Bernardo and Scott is this whole concept of gelatinization and starch, right? So if you're using what I would call a mashable adjunct, like rice or corn, in its unmalted form, you have to do some extra things to get access to that. And the main thing is it's a result of gelatinization. Gelatinization means you have to unwind all of those starch granules in order to get access to the individual starch chains so that the enzymes can start chopping them off into fermentable sugars. It's like 3-step process. Gelatinization unwinds the starch, then the enzymes act to chop it into fermentable sugars, and then the yeast consumes the fermentable sugars and turns it into alcohol and CO2, which is the brewing process. Now, for barley, the gelatinization temperature is like, like 55 Celsius or something like that, 60 Celsius, which is around like 145 or something like that Fahrenheit. But in any event, we're still working with malted barley, which means malted barley is primed. Again, if you've learned one thing by listening to the Brew Lab for the last 2 years, it's that malting is priming the barley to give it ready to do the things that we need it to do in the mash. It's getting all that enzyme package and all those starches ready to go so that all you have to do is an infusion mash, step mash if you want to, but an infusion mash and you can make a fantastic beer. So that to me is one of the biggest things. And that gelatinization for rice and corn, that gelatinization temperature is higher. So if you're using unmalted corn and unmalted rice, you have to get above that gelatinization temperature, which Scott LaFontaine was saying around 85 Celsius, which is around 180, 190 Fahrenheit. And that's a lot. That's almost a boil. So in most cases, that requires a different vessel, a separate vessel. Because if you just dump that in with your malted barley and then raise the temperature to 180, you're going to neutralize all the enzymes that you need to convert the starches into sugars, right? So it doesn't work. So essentially what you have to do is boil or raise the temperature of the rice and corn up to, that temperature, 85 Celsius, and then cool it back down and then add in the malted barley so that you can then utilize that starch. That's a really weird and difficult process to have to do, right? To think about, like, hey, I want it to be simple and easy. And Scott said, hey, this is one of the benefits of using rice malt.
So let's talk through that for a second. This is very interesting to me. So you're saying a cereal mash, the high temperature of that process, that's a gelatinization step.
Yeah, 100%.
And so when does the beta and the alpha amylase come in? Because in a cereal mash, we're typically reserving 10% of the barley to go into the high temperature cereal mash process, which is thus, as we're learning, gelatinizing the adjunct, corn or rice typically, right? So then we add that back to the main mash. Is it during the adding it back to the main mash portion in which the beta and the alpha amylase really goes to work? And if that's the case, why are we including 10% of the barley in the gelatinization step for the cereal adjunct?
That would be a filtration, I'm guessing, mostly for because otherwise you're going to create like oatmeal or corn grits, right? You're going to create like malted cereal or like not malted because that's malted barley, but like like oatmeal consistency. You're going to create this really thick, viscous goo, and if you don't have the beta glucanases and things like that are in barley, and also that filtration of the husk, you're going to create a sticky mess. That's my understanding, at least.
Wow. So it's not actually serving any sort of enzyme purpose at that phase. It's simply to assist with, quote, lautering.
Yeah, that's my understanding. And again, because you're at those high temperatures, you're neutralizing the enzymes. There may still be some enzyme activity at that level, but you're not. Again, it's like think of like a baseball, right? You've got to peel everything off of. You got to peel the outside of the baseball to get into like the starches that are all in a big ball and chain below it. And so if you don't do the gelatinization, gelatinization would be essentially like melt the baseball apart, so that all of that stuff that's wound together, the core in the middle of the baseball, I guess this assumes that you've actually, cut open a baseball or seen the inside of it. But in any event, baseball's got this rubber core and then a whole bunch of, I don't know what it is, but like string or twine wrapped around it really tightly. And that's the way I think about starches. It's all that string and twine that's wrapped around it. So you have to not only peel off the cell, but then unwind all that string, and then the enzymes can start going after it. So yeah, for a cereal mash, very low conversion from, a starch to sugar in that cereal mash. That's why you put that over then into the main mash, and that's where the alpha and beta amylases are still active, and limit dextranase potentially. That's one that we also talked about on the show, but that's where all that stuff is active and required. So that's why that cereal mash is a big deal. And for home brewers and commercial brewers, that requires, like Scott was saying, a capex, a capital expenditure. You have to have another vessel, because you have to have a place where you've raised this to a certain temperature, and then you can add it to the main mash. So you have to essentially have two mashing vessels, one that's high enough, that has a high enough temperature that you can complete the cereal mash.
Yeah, and I'm guessing that from a commercial production standpoint, there is an ROI associated with that, in the sense of, if you're brewing a ton of adjunct lager, it's probably cheaper to buy raw adjuncts like raw corn or whatever than malted corn, because that process of malting it, is an industrial process. So they have to increase the price of the commodity to pay for the malting process. It's kind of like why at the homebrew level, extract, dry malt extract or liquid extract is more expensive than pure malt, because of this added step and the added cost. So a pro brewer, if they're brewing exclusively adjunct lager, they might actually come out on the cheaper end of things if they just have this extra equipment, because they can save on ingredient prices along the way.
Oh man, now I'm really wishing I had asked that question of Scott, because that would have been or Bernardo, either of them, because that would have been a great one. I think that makes sense, right? If you're brewing a huge amount, it would make sense that unmalted rice, just like bags of rice, is going to be cheaper than malted rice, because you don't have to go through the whole malting process. So malted rice would be more expensive, and yeah, you're going to need to do some sort of ROI analysis, I would think, to determine if, okay, is it better for us to get a second mash tun or a cereal cooker that's going to be, I don't know how much, several $1,000s, right? I don't know exactly how much one of those costs, versus, using something like flaked rice. Because I would say one of the things that Scott mentioned, and that is really interesting to him about this whole process, is what if we made malted rice more available? Would that reduce the cost of malted rice, such that malted rice would suddenly be available, and you wouldn't have to, the ROI consideration would include the alternative ingredient of malted rice, which doesn't require that cereal cooker. That's a big thing for this malted rice. It's already gone through the gelatinization. It's already ready. It's primed. It's got its enzyme package ready to go. And it's ready to convert starch to sugar.
Right, and I think actually malted rice is quite expensive when I've looked into it relative to malted barley. And, standard rice is pretty cheap. So there probably are some economics at play there. But you make a good point that the benefit of these malted adjuncts is you can just use them in a normal mash, or allegedly. And so there might be some different considerations there. They might get fewer, gravity points per pound used. And I thought that was really interesting, the comment in that last episode about thinking it from a more macro agronomics perspective, that they can grow more and yield more, but the brewer then yields less. And so at the total system level, it actually might be more sustainable, even though the brewer has to use more of the product to get the same amount of extracted sugar relative to barley due to the yields in the fields.
Yeah, I'm really excited about that study that comes out, right? I mean, they teased that as the next aspect of what they were going to be looking at. They had a master student looking at 197 varieties at poor master student, and measuring essentially how much extract can we get from each of these cultivars of rice. So I'm really looking forward to that, to see if, because another thing that we commented about was because malted barley has been bred specifically for beer, it's been bred to maximize extract potential, right? Because that's its single use. Rice is used as a food. It's still eaten, right? And so it's been bred for food, or for whatever characteristics that we want in meal, like short grain, long grain, medium grain, right? That's one of the breeding characters. We don't care about like short grain, long grain, or medium grain barley, at least not that I've ever heard of. I don't even know if those are things, by the way. I'm just sort of using that as an analogy. But, rice has been bred for these different characteristics. So what if you could, pick a few of these rice varieties and start to breed them, for better extract potential for brewers? Then you would maybe reduce that gap. But the sustainability comment was huge. And I didn't know this until asking Bernardo that question. But his comment about how, as climate change continues and as it gets warmer, barley could potentially reduce by 15 or 20% the amount of acres that are plantable for barley, could reduce by that, but rice could actually grow by 1 to 3% in that same time frame. So there may be more rice grown, and so that also might change those economics a little bit. If barley starts to get more expensive, you might creep towards the cost of malted rice. And then finally, that last thing is, right now malted rice is used mostly for gluten-free brewers. So there's really only a few malt houses out there that are using it, at least that I'm aware of.
Right. Now, I do really like a Japanese-style rice lager, and so can't help but wonder if there is a way to incorporate malted rice into a, quote, normal brew.
Yeah, it would be cool, right? And so before we get off of the mashable ones, there's also this concept of flaked rice and flaked corn, which I know you've used before, Jordan. This is it's pre-gelatinized, essentially, is what it is. And so you can just add it directly to the mash, and then the starch gets converted into sugars. But it's really, that's the way to think about flaked rice and flaked corn, is this pre-gelatinization step. So malted rice has an enzyme package that can self-convert. And Bernardo was saying that they had to adjust some of the temperature and time parameters, much like we would do for barley. But once you got into the right temperature and time parameters, the 11 or 10 of the 11 varieties that they looked into were able to self-convert, which is really cool. Self-convert means take that starch and convert it into fermentable sugars, which is really cool to see that malted rice can work exactly like a malted barley. But again, you have flaked rices and things like that. So as a brewer, if you want to add rice, we'll talk about what that might mean and when we get back from the break. But if you want to add rice, you can use a very simple ingredient like flaked rice. It's very cheap, it's very inexpensive, and you don't have to have a second vessel to use that in your mash tun.
That being said, I've heard some horror stories from pro brewers that didn't get conversion out of their flaked rice.
Oh, really?
And so for that reason, that's why Kevin Davey at Gold Dot, formerly Wayfinder, was the big advocate for cereal mashing his rice and his cold IPAs, because he got burned with this bunk flaked rice that didn't actually ever convert. I think he said he had to go to a friend, a couple breweries over to borrow some iodine, and it just wouldn't pass the test. And so I think that there's probably something with that cereal mash. It should work because at least you're not at the whim of the producer of the flaked product.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's true, right? The whole point of the flaked product is that gelatinization, right? That's the point. It's to get access to those starches. So yeah, maybe there was something wrong with the processor. They didn't get the temperature high enough. It squished it, but it didn't get it gelatinized.
So I think there's a couple other concerns when it relates to using and brewing with adjuncts. When it comes to recipe design, you want to be mindful of the ABV impacts and how much you want to use. Some of these adjuncts you might not want to exceed 40%, and that would probably be a pretty high number for something like corn or rice. You run the risk of drying the beer out too much, or it no longer tasting like a barley-based beer. And maybe that's what you're going for, but just think about that. Typically, it's a minority of the grist, under 50%, and these things tend to really drive attenuation, and so you're going to dry the beer out. Which, if that's what you're going for, in like a crisp pilsner, you're right on the money. But if you're going for a really thick, malty, Bock beer, maybe you don't want to use 40% rice because that's going to ostensibly have a flavor and a mouthfeel effect, which really could be a function of the attenuation. And then, of course, there could be some sort of like inherent flavor of the adjunct. Maybe rice tastes like something. Maybe corn tastes like something.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, it depends on how you use it too, right? How you use the malted corn, which we'll talk about here in a minute. But depending on your use, you may get flavor impacts. But yeah, I mean, if you're doing a cereal mash and converting or gelatinizing your grain and then putting it into the mash, you're going to get a lot of conversion. But I asked this question of Scott and Bernardo: are the starches the same? And they said, well, yeah, it's made of the same stuff, but there may be different, characteristics. There may be different ultimate outcomes. Like maltose is one of the biggest sugars of using malted barley. And similarly, when you use malted rice, maltose is a big outcome. But if you use regular rice, then you don't get necessarily that double sugar. Maltose is 2 glucose units connected together. That's all it is. It's 2 glucose units. If you use if you use rice or corn and do a cereal mash, you're going to get mostly just single glucose. And yeast loves glucose. It ferments it with no problem at all. The other thing about malted barley is you get longer than 2 glucose units. You get maltotriose, which is 3 glucose units, maltotetrose, which is 4 glucose units, and things that we call dextrins, which are 4 glucose units and higher, right? So 5, 6, 7, 8, glucoses stuck together. Those are all a product of the malting process and the enzyme and debranching process that is contained in malted barley. But if you change that enzyme characteristic by using malted rice, adding something like limit dextrinase, which a listener wrote in about a few weeks ago and we talked about on feedback, you can suddenly debranch some of those dextrins. Those 4, 5, 6 chain dextrins become now 2 or 1 that yeast can use. So this is a really cool thing too, that adding rice generally drives a body and mouthfeel and attenuation. The body and mouthfeel goes lower, the attenuation gets higher, and the beer dries out. There's more alcohol and a low flavor impact. That's the American light lager ethos, right? Add rice so that it makes a dry, crisp beer with minimal flavor impact. But what if you added malted rice? You might be able to drive that even lower. You might be able to get even a higher extract, which means you might be able to use fewer barley ingredients or other ingredients. So this is a really cool application of something like malted rice because it comes with an enzyme package that's different than barley, but used together might create something that actually helps brewers that aren't necessarily trying to do it just to make American light lager.
Yeah, and that's why this is such a fun hobby, right? Is that there are so many different, flavors in the palette toolbox that we can work with. And understanding the science really helps you be a better brewer and a better user, a better steward of these ingredients. So maybe it's time we take a break and we can come back in a little bit and talk a little bit more about some of our experiences using adjuncts in brewing.
All right, sounds good. We'll be right back. One of the biggest improvements to my brewing practices was the upgrade to stainless steel, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which holds 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to reduce the chances of a messy blow-off, and it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brew systems out there, and their prices are remarkably affordable. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, you've got to check out deltabrewingsystems.com. We all know that designing recipes is really fun, and doing it well is so much easier with good software. We at Brülosophy recently made the switch to Brewfather, and honestly, y'all, we could not be happier. Brewfather utilizes the latest technology to bring you the most robust cloud-based recipe design software that can be accessed anywhere, on your phone, tablet, desktop, and even offline. It also works seamlessly with numerous third-party devices to make it easier to monitor every step of your brew. I know change can be difficult, but trust me when I say you need to go to brewfather.app today to try it out for yourself. That's brewfather.app. I'll never forget the first time I tried a Belgian goose. My first thought was, what the F is this? It's sour and stinky, and for some reason I actually like it. It's complex. There's a lot going on. It's totally the opposite spectrum of American light lager, right? Which is intended to be crisp, crushable, refreshing. It's not complex. It's very simple, very easy to drink, and quaffable. Whereas I'm sure some people out there quaff Belgian gooses because some people are weird, but that's a sipping beer to me. It's one that's complex. It's got a lot of flavor. And Jordan, of course, I know you're a fan of them as well.
Well, it's funny, as different and polar opposite as these two beers may be, they share one thing in common, and that's the considerable use of adjuncts. And so it really goes to show that corn itself or wheat itself does not totally define the beer. There's so many other things going on, fermentation, etc. And so look at a cold IPA versus an American adjunct lager or a malt liquor, right? Drastic differences in the amounts and types of hops used, but other things in the middle could be pretty similar. And so by no means can you simply hang your hat up like, yep, I used rice, it's now a rice beer, and that's what it tastes like. There's a lot else going on there. And so I think within the context of using these adjuncts, I think might be kind of cool to look through some of the experiments we've done and see, can people actually taste a difference between adjunct A versus B, or, with adjunct or without?
Yeah, exactly. And I think we should go through some of these. I think that it makes sense to start also with the mashable adjuncts, so the ones that bring starches to the beer. And since we were just talking about malted rice, I think we'll start with the ones. So for mashable adjuncts, there's kind of two components. There's ones that come with an enzyme package ready to go that can self-convert, and then there's one that come with no enzyme. So let's start with like the malted rice, okay? That comes with enzymes. It's malted, so it comes with enzymes. But there's also been an experiment where we looked at malted blue corn. So Will brewed this beer with malted blue corn, which is kind of like, to think about it, like blue corn is this like very traditional Native American ingredient for like the Southwest United States and northern Mexico. And so there was lots of beers that were brewed with it, and famously there was one beer called Chicha, and Chicha is famous because to brew this beer you would chew the corn in your mouth to get the enzymes activating to gelatinize and crush up the starches, and then you would spit it out and then mash it and then ferment it. So it's kind of like gross to think about, like chewed beer, but the whole idea was getting access to this blue corn. And so the malted version of the blue corn is, instead of having to chew it and then spit it in and let it ferment, you can just malt the blue corn, and then it comes with its own enzyme package, which was really cool. So he did this, and he served it to 24 tasters. 13 would have been required to taste a difference. Oh, I guess I should tell you what it was against. So it's malted blue corn versus all malt versus a 100% malt. So again, 81.8% malted barley, 18.2% blue corn, malted blue corn, and then the other batch was 100% all malt. And so again, we had 24 tasters in this one. 13 would have had to be right to identify a difference in the samples, and only 9 did, meaning that a 20% batch of malted blue corn tasted the same as a 100% all malt beer.
That's fascinating because I myself tested the same blue corn. He sent me 10 pounds. And in 40% of the grist, it was a pretty dramatic difference relative to a flaked equivalent. There was also a huge OG difference. Like
you did
20 points.
You did
greater.
that. You did that in a cold IPA, right?
And that was in a cold IPA. And the malted corn cold IPA had this like earthy, dare I say dirty, maybe medicinal flavor. And we started getting some reader comments saying, I've messed around with some malted corn and at high percentages, I'm getting something off too. So that's interesting that tasters couldn't tell the difference because they couldn't mine when only used at about 20% of the grist. I'm curious, do you see strong OG differences between those two beers?
Let me take a look real quick too. And while we do that, you should say that you did this experiment, but you also did tasters, right? You ran it through a panel of tasters. And did they find it significant?
It was significant. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but tasters could reliably distinguish a cold IPA brewed with malted corn versus flaked corn, and the preference was handily for the flaked version. But again, given that Will didn't reach significance, I think there's something to be said about using really high proportions of that particular ingredient. It's just kind of intense, and I've used it in a much smaller amount and couldn't even tell it was there.
Yeah, and so from a gravity perspective, right, the all barley malt batch was 1049 OG, and the blue corn batch was 1044 OG. So about 5 percentage points there. So 2 or so degrees Plato. But then they finished very similarly. So they finished the all malt batch finished at 1010, and the blue corn malt finished at 1011. So that means that the all barley one actually attenuated a little bit more than the blue corn batch did. Which is interesting. Very similar finishing gravities, but differences in OG. So it seems like there was definitely some a lower extract when using the 20% malted corn. And I'm curious, Jordan, do you remember off the top of your head your numbers whenever you saw it? Did you see a reduction in efficiency as well?
It's pretty dramatic. This is I'm rounding here based on memory, but something like 1070 for the flaked corn at 40% of the grist versus like 1050 with malted corn. And they attenuated kind of similarly, maybe 1010 versus 1007. I don't remember which was which. But so what that means is that we saw way more attenuation as well with the flaked version. And the net effect was it tasted more boozy. And that is going to interact with all the hops that you're using, hop utilization in the boil as well. But I'm curious, Cade, so they make corn sugar, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They make rice syrup solids too, which is rice sugar. And those are 100% fermentable, I gather. What's the chemistry going on there? Why would a sugar extracted from a grain be more, or in this case, more fermentable than a malted version of the grain?
Yeah, so again, the sugar is actually being chopped up, right? It's being chopped up into those the fermentable components. Now, I'm not sure exactly what the process is. It might actually be like a physical grinding, right? The pulverizing of the sugar might grind it up into units. I don't think it's going to drop it into units that are just 100% glucose. Part of it makes me wonder if there's like some sort of malting or gelatinization step or something that occurs ahead of sugar production. I don't know enough about sugar production, but it is my understanding that dextrose, for example, corn sugar, and that's something we use for bottle conditioning, which we'll talk about here in a minute, but corn sugar is 100% fermentable. So it's going to be, dextrose is just glucose chains. Dextrose is D-glucose, dextrorotatory glucose. That's the long chemical name for it. Most people call it dextrose. But remember, I told you maltose is 2 glucose units. Dextrose or glucose, dextrorotatory glucose is 1 unit of glucose. That's a very simple sugar. When we talk about simple sugars, that's a simple sugar. Yeast prefers to consume glucose. It's preferential. It's going to pick up all those sugars that are easy to consume. So fructose and glucose, it's going to pick up first before it excretes any enzymes that are necessary to break down maltose. All right. It does have to break down maltose. It has to cut it in half into 2 glucose units to get it into the cell and consume it. So the yeast loves to eat glucose, and it will do it first. So if you put a whole bunch of dextrose in the beer, the yeast is going to consume all that. It's 100% fermentable, and they're going to use that to make alcohol and CO2, and then switch over to the other sugars, maltose and such. So yeah, when you add corn sugar or rice syrup solids, those are 100% fermentable because it's just glucose that's being added in that way.
Yeah, and this is why you'll sometimes hear people suggest that you actually add these simple sugars to high Krausen. The fear being that the yeast would get used to fermenting these simple sugars if they're present in the wort at yeast pitch, and then could like kind of get lazy when it gets to more complicated foods like the more complex fermentable sugars that are present from or extracted from barley and stuff.
Yeah, that's totally right. I mean, they again, like I said, there's an enzyme called maltase that the yeast has to make in order to break maltose into the 2 glucose units. And if it's just in the presence of glucose, it'll never make maltase. And so if it doesn't make the enzyme, then the maltose just sits around. This is have
you messed around with that before?
No, I've never messed around with that. It's really it's one of those things that yeast does. It's this whole like Crabtree effect, like yeast preferring or being able to generate energy faster in anaerobic conditions than in aerobic conditions. And because of a bunch of chemical components to it. So yeast loves to consume maltose. It does like that, but it creates this enzyme, this maltase enzyme. This is a key distinction between brewing yeast and wine yeasts. Wine yeasts don't I don't know that they've lost the ability to create maltase, but it's kind of fallen off of their genome because grapes are sucrose, which is glucose and fructose. And those are 2 simple sugars that the yeast can consume and actually, again, prefers to consume those. So those wine yeasts are used to glucose and fructose, sucrose, whereas brewer's yeast are used to maltose being the primary sugar. So that's the kind of the key difference between malt or brewer's yeast and wine yeast. But we digress. So we're way off into chemistry of sugars, which is really interesting, but kind of a little far away from adjuncts. So again, we were talking about those mashable adjuncts that come with enzymes, and malted blue corn being one of them. So Will did that experiment looking at malted blue corn versus 100% all malt, and you did an experiment looking at malted corn versus flaked. Again, at different percentages. Yours was 40%, Will's was 20%, and you guys saw very real differences. But the key there is in all of those cases, the malted corn and the flaked corn, you had already gotten past the gelatinization step. So you guys didn't need to do a cereal mash in order to access the starches from those grains, right?
That's right. And I think I've only done a cereal mash once. It was on a Japanese rice lager. It was actually an Italian rice lager. It was a pretty cool little beer that me and a friend did. But I tell you, it never dropped clear. No matter how much gelatin I added, I could never get that thing to drop clear. And it was using a unique Italian rice that my friend sourced. Is that a concern with cereal mash beers or rice beers for that matter? The risk of haze that you wouldn't see with an all barley beer?
Well, it's interesting. I wouldn't have thought so for rice. For oats, for sure, because their protein content's much higher. I wouldn't have thought that for rice, but maybe. I mean, I don't know. Maybe it was the specific variety of rice that you guys were using that had maybe a higher protein content or something. And then, because the cereal mash is going to unwind some of those proteins, but if you're not doing the things to have that protein settle out, like Whirlflock or something, I don't know. I'm not exactly sure. I'd be totally spitballing without knowing the process, but maybe that's what caused some of that haze. But it shouldn't generally. Rice doesn't generally create haze. That's one of the reasons why it's favored for mass American adjunct lagers. Those things are crystal clear. Not just because they're filtered, but also because there's not a lot of protein that's contributed by the rice. But there are other ingredients that are malted, like malted wheats and malted oats, and some of those are, again, things we talked about earlier. You've got to look at the protein content, you got to look at the starch content, and understand whether they can self-convert if you're going to use them. Malted wheat, of course, is a big component in German beer. Especially like Weiss beers, which you're going to use something like 60%, right, of the grist in order to make a Weiss beer, right, Jordan? I think that's at least my understanding.
Yeah, I think 50-50, 60-40 is not unheard of, maybe even 70-30. But maybe we can talk real quick about some of the considerations for using malted wheat. It's funny. I use a lot of malted wheat in West Coast IPA. And I'll go like 20% malted wheat in my grist. And I'm curious if you think this is doing what I think it's doing, but I'm also doing like 7% simple sugar. And so that simple sugar is going to really dry it out. And I'm mashing low. I'm adding enzyme. I'm using highly fermentable, highly attenuated yeast. So I'm trying to get from like, 1060 down to like 1005 or so, 1006. So that's 1.5 Plato or so, finishing gravity. And so I'm thinking that maybe that wheat just provides some like perceived body, but without the like gravity points and a final gravity to give you like sweetness or something. So what do you think of that approach of like maximizing attenuation, drying it out, minimizing, quote unquote body, but having a hefty dose of wheat to kind of like back it up so it's just not too dry on the tongue?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that brewers do a lot, right? I think they do oats and wheat. I mean, I think that's a very common practice because if you're adding something like dextrose, you are going to drive attenuation. That's going to drive the dryness. There we go. That's a weird way to say it, but it's going to drive the dryness of the beer up, making it crisp and light and refreshing, but reducing the body quite a bit. Yeah, so things like protein and leftover starches, or leftover long chain sugars like dextrins, those are going to change body. They're not necessarily going to be sweet, but they're going to change body. And so, yeah, maybe adding something like malted wheat or malted oats adds some of that body back in so that you can still have a dry, highly attenuated beer, but add some body back to it. So, yeah, I think it's a very common approach. And so that's, of course, those mashable adjuncts that come with their enzymes. But most of what we use as certainly as home brewers are adjuncts that are, and really commercial brewers too, are adjuncts that don't come with an enzyme package pre-made, right? So we don't generally use malted rice or malted corn. Some people do, but they're not in high use. Usually whenever brewers are using rice or corn, they're doing something called a cereal mash, which is what we talked about earlier. It's at a high temperature, roughly like 85 Celsius or something like 180, 190 Fahrenheit, in that range. And the whole point is you need to gelatinize those starches so that they become available for the enzymes to access. Now, if you're a home brewer, it's going to be really hard to do a cereal mash, especially if you just have one vessel. You're going to have to do something like mash in a cooler, right? Where you take your mash tun, heat everything up to mashing temperatures, and then move it over into a cooler to keep it warm, and then do your regular rice or regular corn in a cereal mash, get that up to a high temperature, and then add that over, to your mash that's going in a cooler. That's kind of how cereal mashing works at a homebrew level. From a commercial pro brewer level, you're going to have a cereal cooker. So that's an entirely separate vessel that can reach those temperatures. And let me be clear too, a lot of mash tuns can't reach that level because they don't have venting capabilities, right? They don't have like steam escape capabilities like a kettle does. So a lot of mash vessels aren't rated at those higher temperatures and can't really deal with things at that higher temperatures because it hurts and destroys the vessel. So this is a big consideration for a commercial brewer. If you're going to put in a mash cooker, it's going to be a significant capital expenditure to add that vessel just so that you can make American light lagers.
Well, I actually disagree with your first point, though. I think it's pretty easy for a home brewer, but it might take some jerry rigging, right? So if you're doing kind of an old schooler approach where you have like a mash tun that's like an igloo cooler and then you're like boiling in some sort of metal pot, you could just use your boil kettle for your cereal mash, and then you pour that into your plastic igloo cooler. Or if you're using an all-in-one system, you're going to need some sort of external thing. Just use like a pasta pot that you boil water for, like in your kitchen, and just do it on your stovetop and then walk it outside or downstairs or whatever. So it might take a little bit of, moving things around, of hot, boiling liquid and stuff, but it's actually not that hard at the homebrew level. But you might just need to dip into your kitchen cabinet and borrow some of your like home cooking equipment to do it.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, so that where there's a will, there's a way always, and homebrewers are nothing if not innovative. And so, yeah, certainly, if you can innovate a way to do it, that's certainly a good idea. But it does require that extra processing step of boiling, finding some way, or not necessarily boiling, but raising it close to boiling temperature for gelatinization. So those are some of the main ones. Do you have any other thoughts, Jordan, on a non-enzymatic grains?
I'm curious, corn, it seems like it comes in a dried format when they're using it in these adjunct brews. Can you brew with corn from the grocery store and like cut it off the stalk? And if so, how is that different than a dried format that they're using at Budweiser or something?
Yeah, I wonder, because so much of like the drying process is just to be able to transport it around the country, right? Because it's going to sit on a rail car for a long time. And if it's wet, it's going to, start to malt and convert. So yeah, I don't know. Maybe you could. What an interesting experiment. Buy some corn from the grocery store and see if, you can brew with just corn off of the husk. I mean, that's kind of where that chicha thing came in, right? They would just like chew the corn and then spit it out, right? I don't think they were eating dried corn, right? They were just eating like corn off of a cob, I would assume, chewing it and then spitting it in. But maybe it was dried corn. I don't know. I guess I've never thought of it that way. I don't know. Interesting experiment to like take corn from the grocery store and see if you can brew with it.
Yeah, we'll put Will or Steve on that one.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, Will or Steve, you guys are listening. You guys take that one. Now, there are, of course, other grains. Like we talked about flaked grains, and we talked about an experiment that you did, Jordan, looking at flaked corn versus malted corn. But we've done a number of experiments looking at flaked ingredients and how those impact the beer. For example, we looked at flaked barley. What? Flaked barley? Why would you need to do flaked barley? Well, the same reason. Barley has a gelatinization step, and so if you use pre-gelatinized barley, maybe it adds something that the regular barley doesn't have. And so this was done. So Will did this one back in an Irish stout as a flaked barley. And so he used, in one case, 30% flaked barley, and in the rest case, some like a all malt beer, which had some Munich and some chocolate and some crystal. I guess it also had some roasted barley in it, so it wasn't totally malted. But again, 30% flaked barley in one and not in the other. And he served this to 26 tasters. He would have had to have 14 to reach significance, but only 12 did, meaning that the tasters weren't able to reliably distinguish a flaked barley versus regular barley in an Irish stout. Now, so flaked barley, I'm wondering if it requires less mashing. I mean, I don't know if you heard about using flaked barley before, Jordan?
I actually do have a few recipes that rely on flaked barley. So they say it adds a creaminess, and I could see how you would add that to an Irish extra stout. And maybe, just all the roast, it's just kind of hard to tell blind, they were kind of close to reaching significance there, but weren't quite there. So maybe just the average human would struggle to tell the difference in a roasted format, but maybe to add something in a paler format that would be easier to discern. That'd be good for future testing. But I use flaked barley in my cream ale recipe. My cream ale contains no corn. Rumor has it at one point, or I don't know if it's now or previously, that Spotted Cow didn't use corn but used flaked barley. And so I've really enjoyed flaked barley as my kind of adjunct in my cream ale. And when I was making hazy IPAs, I had a kind of a really easy rule of thumb recipe where I would do 70% either Pilsner or two-row malt, and then 10% wheat, and that would be flaked or malted, just depending whatever I grabbed, 10% oats, and those would be flaked oats, and then 10% flaked barley. And I picked that trick up from Breakside. They were using flaked barley and, appealing to authority, I'll admit. But it seemed to bring some level of creaminess to it, and it's really easy to use. So love flaked barley when you're looking for that little extra creaminess in your beer.
Yeah, that's interesting. And of course, there are things like flaked corn and flaked oats, flaked rice. We did a flaked corn experiment. Mike did this one back in 2022 in a British golden ale. He did 21% flaked corn versus 100% barley. And so I think, this is one of those we were talking earlier, Jordan, about percentages, right? At 20%, is the flaked corn going to change the flavor perception of the barley? And it did not. There were 21 tasters. He would have had to have 12, but only 7 picked it correctly, so that one was not significant. That 21% flaked corn didn't change the overall flavor of the barley. Now, I'm curious if flaked corn is cheaper than malted barley, or if it's like more expensive because of the flaking process. So is that like a way to save some cost as a brewer? And then, of course, there was also one where we did flaked rice. And so that one had 20% flaked rice versus a 100% all malt beer. And that one was served to the Wingnut Brew Club. I'm not sure where the Wingnut Brew Club is, but I want to give them a shout out for participating and lending their palates. But in any event, 25 people tasted the beer. They would have had to have 12 to get it right, but only 11 made the accurate selection. So again, in that 20% range, flaked rice and flaked corn, we seem to not have a significant result, at least comparing it to 100% all malt barley.
Right. And so I think that what this exposes is that when used as a minority of the grist, it's not a night and day effect, that it generally tastes similar-ish to an all barley beer. So I think that's a blessing and a curse. On one hand, if you're really trying to pump corn flavor into your beer, maybe good luck. On the other hand, it suggests that, maybe Bud Miller Coors isn't as evil as they're, described as, and that these adjuncts aren't adding that much flavor, actually.
Yeah. At least or maybe they're not taking away the flavor, right? Like the BMC, the Bud Miller Coors beers, are saying like, oh yeah, they use this and it takes away, it strips all the flavor from the beer. No, maybe they want it to be crisp and crushable, at that rate.
Well, they also water them down, so there's your flavor stripping right there.
Well, true. So they would call it trimming, I think, and that's a common, again, it all depends on, the lawyer in me is going to come out here. It all depends on how you define it, right? But sure, they would say that they high gravity brew, I think. So they brew to a higher gravity and then trim down to the alcohol content and gravity that they want to hit at the end of the beer. So again, they wouldn't say watered down, they would say trimming to hit the accurate level.
And there is a serious sustainability benefit there, right? Because that means they can sell more beer, but using less tank space. But I'm curious, are the light beers just more watered down versions of the standard strength ones, or do they do different brews for Budweiser versus Bud Light?
That's a great question. My understanding is they are different brews brewed to different gravities, but are they just watered down versions? I don't know. That's a good question, right? Like they are brewing differently, but are they brewing differently to say that they're brewing differently, or are they brewing differently because that's actually doing a flavor difference? I mean, who knows? I think certainly the light versions of American Adjunct Lager taste different, right, than the other ones. So whether that's watered down or just a totally different brew, it's kind of, that's probably somebody that AB would have to answer that question. But we do have, we've looked at now flaked ingredients, and we've looked at malted ingredients, and you did an experiment looking at malted versus flaked ingredients. We also have another one looking at malted versus flaked rye. Now, again, rye is one of those ingredients that's not known for bringing enzymes to the table, right? Rye isn't a self-converting grain, at least as far as I'm aware. So malting the rye makes it then self-converting, versus flaked rye, which again, maybe it would add that creaminess to it. So you've got enzyme package versus like creaminess, or I would say, again, malted rye is going to maybe change the outcome of the beer, the actual sugars that are produced, whereas flaked rye is just using the enzymes present in barley. So you might have in malted rye a bunch of glucose or fructose, and that might change the outcome of the beer. Well, Steve put that to the test, looking at malted rye versus flaked rye. He did this back in 2021. So this was, of course, during our COVID protocol. There were no tasters other than Steve who tasted this beer, but he did taste it 10 times and would have had to, I apologize. This is not the COVID beer. This is one where he did do this when he served this one to tasters, to 20 people. He would have had to have 11 get it right, but 9 did. So 9 people. So it was not significant. People were not able to taste the difference between malted rye and flaked rye at 20% of the grist.
Yeah, so it suggests that the two ingredients are fairly interchangeable. That was, kind of my thought when it came to using a smaller percentage of wheat in a hazy IPA that, flaked, malted, whatever. Do you use rye much? I'm curious what you think. They say that it's spicy. I like a little bit of rye in a Saison sometimes, but it's honestly an ingredient I haven't bought in a while.
I love rye. I like to add it in an IPA because I think it adds mouthfeel. I've never gotten spiciness from rye, and I always wonder if that's just because people talk about rye bread, which has caraway in it. And that's that spiciness, right? Caraway seed definitely tastes spicy to me, but rye malt and rye doesn't. Anytime I'm looking to add body, rye is one of my go-tos because I just love it. It adds this like really thick body. And it's really easy for me to like, if I've got a beer that is lacking in body or that's too thin, add a little bit of rye in and boom, it's like, oh, that's money. So that's one of the reasons I like it.
And what is it with rye that makes it so viscous, like the actual resulting liquid? It seems that like relative to all the adjuncts we've talked about, that is the stickiest one. And I think you even had a podcast on rye way back in the day on this show that talked more about rye. But like I've heard of like 80%, 100% rye beers that are just pour like syrup. What is going on with this grain?
Yeah, that's a great question. I wish I could remember back to my conversation. That was with Harmony Bettenhausen. We talked about rye. Maybe I can shoot her an email and ask that. I don't remember, but maybe there's some difference in, either the arabinoxylans or the beta-glucan concentration. That's like this was one that Sophie Held said from UC Davis. It's like the packaging, like a present. You're unwrapping the packaging and you've got to get all of this arabinoxylan and beta-glucans out. And if you don't get those out, the packaging sticks around and just creates a mess. It's like a whole bunch of pieces of material that are still in the way that just make it sticky. So maybe they've got more of those and it's harder to get through when using that. But I don't know. Good question. Maybe I'll reach out to Harmony and see what she thinks about the stickiness of that. Now, we talked about mashable adjuncts, but we mentioned earlier that there are things that you can add that are already mashed, that are just sugar added to the boil. And I mentioned the Belgian brewing tradition, so I'd be remiss if we didn't at least spend a couple of minutes talking about some of the Belgian brews. And we've done a couple of experiments with this. So we did one beer. Will did this one in a Belgian double where he compared dark brown sugar versus D45 candy syrup. So compositionally, those things might be similar, right? Again, dark brown sugar is just brown sugar with, I understand, or is white sugar with like molasses added to it, right? Whereas candy sugar is made in a whole different process where the sugar's like boiled and reduced and then caramelized and made into this like very thick, viscous sugary syrup, or hardened and made into hard chunks, but usually into a syrup, whereas brown sugar then stays in that crystalline form, and obviously no molasses added, right? But can you make the same flavors using something like dark brown sugar and candy sugar? So he served this to 25 people, would have had to have 13 to reach significance, but only 10 did, which meant that, he was able to make a beer that tasted similar, or that at least people weren't able to tell different, using dark brown sugar versus candy sugar. That's striking.
Yeah, and this is one of those pieces of homebrew lore, right? Or brewing lore in general, that if you're going to make a Belgian beer with the candy sugar, you got to use the real Belgian candy sugar, or it will not taste like a Belgian beer. And I think that it's telling is how expressive these yeasts are, right? In that if this was Belgian beers used like a really clean fermenting strain like Chico or something, maybe it would be easier to detect the differences. But I think with all the esters and phenols that these things throw off, I'm not terribly surprised that the majority of tasters could not distinguish between brown sugar and candy sugar.
Yeah, and it's funny, too, because I think, again, hearkening back to this Belgian brewing tradition, I think if you told Belgians that you're like, hey, I brewed a double with brown sugar, they'd be like, why? And be like, well, Belgian sugar's hard to get. And they're like, okay, cool. And they would be like, yeah, did it taste good? Yeah, great. Awesome. You made a great double, right? They would want it to be with Belgian candy sugar, but that's because it's readily available there for them. So I think this is in that Belgian ethos of, sure, brew with what you've got. You made it with brown sugar. Great. We're doing the same, candy sugar is just serving a slightly different purpose. And also there was one more too with this Belgian candy sugar in crystalline form versus candy sugar in syrup form. So Phil did this one back in 2019, served it to 21 tasters, a Belgian candy sugar in, let's see, what was the style? A Belgian golden strong ale. So served this again to 21 tasters, would have had to have 12 to get it right, but only 4 did. So the crystalline form of Belgian candy sugar was no different than the syrup form. Now, I'm sure that, he stored these well and the syrup was fresh, because I'm sure if it was exposed to oxygen, that syrup would wouldn't have survived as well as the crystalline form. But in this case, fresh, nice ingredients, they resulted in a non-significant beer difference.
Right. And so maybe as we kind of wrap up the kettle section here, there's some different considerations that one might think about when they add them. Do you add them at the beginning of the boil versus the end of the boil? I think something like a simple sugar probably doesn't matter. One thing to keep in mind is it will affect your hop utilization and the IBUs that are extracted, because that is in part a function of how strong in terms of gravity points the wort is when you're boiling these things. So, in your brewing calculator, you can say that you add it after the boil. So just be mindful of that. I think that for a lot of sugars, it doesn't really matter when you add it. It could be a preference thing. There could be some concerns around like boil overs or something. So that's why some people add it as the wort is still heating up to a boil. And maybe stir it around so you don't get any caramelization at the bottom of your kettle. But something like honey or maple syrup, that might be something that you do want to add at the tail end of the boil, or maybe actually add it straight into the fermenter, because if there is some sort of delicate, flavor and aroma that exists within some of these products like honey and maple syrup, maybe a 60-minute boil would boil that all off and it's too volatile. So some unique considerations for a couple of these kettle adjuncts there.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, always something to keep in mind is like we're not just adding these for fermentation, right? We're not just adding these as sugar sources. A lot of these, quote, adjuncts add flavor. Like fruit, for example, is one that we add. Honey, you use because you want some of those aromatics. Like candy sugar, you're adding because it's got already some Maillard reactions that have gone. It's got those dark fruit characteristics that are great in a Belgian double. So we're thinking about flavor components to this too, and that's one of the reasons I think we'll end here on this one. Is I mentioned earlier bottle conditioning sugars, and Jordan, you did an experiment looking at bottling with candy sugar versus dextrose. And we've already talked about dextrose is just D-glucose. It's just sugar in its purest form. So the yeast will ferment it. It's 100% fermentable, but candy sugar's obviously not. There's things in there that, create color and that create differences in the way that it smells versus dextrose, right? I mean, dextrose, I'm sure, doesn't have much of a smell, whereas candy sugar does. And so you're adding this as bottle conditioning. Well, I'll let you say, like, why did you want to do this experiment, like checking out candy sugar versus dextrose as a bottle conditioning sugar?
So when it comes to Belgian beers, I'm a big fan of bottle conditioning them. I pretty much won't keg them because you just cannot get the same level of high carbonation in the keg and out of the tap successfully into your glass, right? And so I love bottling my Belgian beers. And when I made this Trappist single, I got the candy sugar for the sake of authenticity. And I only used half of the package to in the boil kettle, and I realized that the second half was the right amount for a bottling sugar source the first time I made it. And that beer actually ended up going on and winning gold at NHC. So I was like, maybe there's some magic in using this candy sugar as the bottling sugar, right? Let's put it to the test. So I bottled half the batch with candy sugar, and that the way you do that, because it's like a liquid, and I'm using the 1 or the 0 or whatever, so it's actually not adding any color. It's the lightest one. I would like boil it in the microwave to basically dissolve it. Similar process with the powdered dextrose, and I bottle conditioning these to like 3.2 volumes or something like that. I'm going off memory here, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I remember it was not significant. And
yeah, you served it to 20 tasters. 11 would have been required, but only 4.
Yeah,
got it right.
These beers tasted the same, and I obviously did the calculation so that they would have the same volume CO2, and they looked similar, they poured similar, had similar levels of foam and carbonation. So the candy sugar is probably more expensive. Boiling it down to a liquid state from its like kind of crusty, viscous state is an added step that you don't have to deal with dextrose. So going forward, I really see no reason to use candy sugar unless I like somehow got some free or something and might as well use it. But it just seemed to be an added hassle with no observable benefit.
Yeah, or maybe if you got into the higher colors, right? If you got into like a D45 or something brown and we're trying to go into a double, maybe it would add a little bit of flavor or character to it, but I don't know. Again, I mean, it's interesting.
Okay, that's a really interesting idea. What if you made a like Belgian single or something that was totally pale, all pale malt, and you use that as the bottling sugar, like a D45 or D90 or something, what would the impact be? Could you like split a batch, make single, and then just, I mean, maybe the hopping rates aren't totally the same, and then bottle half with a darker sugar? Would it make a double in the bottle?
I don't know. I mean, what color impact would it have? Because it's not like you're adding a whole lot of that sugar. But who knows? Maybe there would be some flavor differences, or maybe you'd make a great Belgian golden ale, right? By bottling with that sugar. But in any event, one of the big takeaways I think from our discussion today has been, hey, you can use. There are a lot of ingredients out there other than just malted barley, and a lot of them may not even significantly impact the flavor or taste of the beer. So there's a lot of wiggle room here. If you've got honey and you want to bottle condition with it, or you've got some leftover candy sugar and you've been using dextrose, hey, maybe that's something that you can send to NHC and win a gold medal with. I don't know that we'll all be as lucky as Jordan was in that case, but there's a lot of opportunity out there for brewing with, quote, adjuncts, or things that aren't malted barley. Anything else you wanted to talk about with respect to adjuncts today, Jordan?
No, I think they're a really exciting ingredient in the toolkit, and I look forward to continue to crafting interesting beverages using all the adjuncts that are out there.
Yeah, I'm really excited to see these upcoming experiments with Scott and his students. So we'll have him back on the show once those get published. But of course, Jordan and I will be back in a few weeks with our next Applying the Science episode, and so we'll see y'all then. The Brew Lab is a production of Brülosophy, where they who drink beer think beer. Don't forget to visit Brülosophy.com to read about our weekly experiments and other brewing adventures, and listen to us talk about it on our other show, the Brülosophy Podcast. Thanks to all of our sponsors and patrons that help make this show possible. If you'd like to receive a reward for helping us do what we do, visit patreon.com/Brülosophy to see how you can do just that. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back in the Brew Lab with another guest next week. Until then, think beer.
Ever tried reading while jogging, cooking, or even juggling flaming torches? Yeah, it doesn't end well. But with audiobooks.com, you can conquer books without the circus act. Dive into over 450,000 titles, including more than 10,000 free ones. Get hooked on a bestseller, find your next obsession, or finally read that classic you've been avoiding since high school. And here's the inside scoop. Sign up today for a free 30-day trial and snag your first 3 audiobooks on the house. Sign up for your free trial at audiobooks.com/podcastfree today. That's audiobooks.com/podcastfree.